Welcome back to an exclusive episode that you definitely do not want to miss. This is episode 6 of the Athletes platform, where we put the athlete first and give them a platform to share their story, all while providing you, the listener, with the insight that you need to push yourself on and off the track. As always, I'm your host, Aaron Booth, and I was super excited to get today's guest on the show, as she is someone that I personally looked up to as a young athlete. She is the multi-talented, law professional, New Zealand record holder, Portia Bing. You can find her on Instagram at Portia Bing, so please go over and show her some support, help support her career, give her a follow, and keep up to date with what she's doing this season. Portia began her athletics career as a heptathlete, where she went on to represent New Zealand and come 5th at the World Juniors and 16th at the World Champs in 2015 as a 22-year-old. She has since transitioned into the 400 meter hurdles and now holds the New Zealand record in that event and has competed at the World Champs in Doha 2019 in the 4 hurdles. Portia has had a very unique career to date, which we discuss at length throughout the episode. We talk about her moving to France to train with the now decathlon world record holder Kevin Meyer's training group, which is something that I could only dream of, as well as what made her decide to transition from a heptathlete into a 400 meter hurdler. Portia juggles her full-time athletics career with a full-time job in law working for the Serious Fraud Office, which was a hot topic in today's episode, but not as hot as Portia speaking out for the first time about her Olympic situation. Although she was in the top 40 in the world for her event, warranting a place at the Olympics to represent New Zealand, Portia explains why she wasn't selected for the games, what the appeal process was like, and what needs to change to prevent confusion in future selections so the same thing doesn't happen again. This episode is an extremely insightful and transparent look into what Portia has gone through throughout her career, and especially over the past few months with dealing with the Olympics. Before the episode begins, quickly share this with someone who you think will want to listen to the episode. You and them definitely don't want to miss this. Please enjoy episode 6 with Portia Bing. Thanks for taking some time. I know you're busy, so we'll try and keep it relatively short. But
yeah, no, good.
I think something that I've started talking about a lot on the show is like my passion for combined events and not specializing at a young age. And I think as a former heptathlete, you are probably somewhat in the same category. So going back to the start of your career, why did you choose athletics? And more importantly, why did you choose the heptathlon? Because I'm sure, I mean, you're a talented athlete. I'm sure you probably could have gone down any sporting option you would have liked and been pretty successful. So yeah, why athletics? Why heptathlon?
I started athletics because when I was younger, I only had the option of doing all the sports that either my brothers were doing, because it was like a situation where my parents were like, we're going there, you either participate or you stand on the sideline and watch.
Yeah.
So athletics became one of those events for me where I was like, okay, I'll participate. So I actually started when I was really young, like grassroots. I think I might have been like 5 or 6 years old, just kind of running along at the local club. But I probably seriously didn't start training and thinking about properly training until I was about 19.
Yeah.
But everywhere in between there, I still did athletics because it was just a fundamental sport. We did it at high school. I had friends in sports, so it was kind of more of a social thing, but I did a lot of other sports. I actually got into heptathlon by mistake because my coach at the time, Russ, he just sent me down to nationals to do multi-events because at the time, I can't even remember how old I was. I think I might have still been at school. I could run, I could jump, I couldn't throw, which was a really weird thing. And then I just went down. And he's like, oh, just go do one for fun. So I just went into the multis for fun, and heptathlon for fun, and I think I might have broken the national record or something, and then I qualified for World Juniors. Yeah. So I guess that's how I got into it.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of cool to hear you say you didn't really start focusing on training until you got to like 19. And I mean, I was pretty similar. I was kind of 17, 18 was when it was like, all right, decathlon is what I want to do. Let's actually start training for it. So it's good to see that you're not having to train as a heptathlete or a decathlete from like the age of 11. Like I know some people in Europe have done that. It's cool.
Yeah,
it's cool to see a different way to do it.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's value in both ways. I think in hindsight, there's a lot of things that I could have been a better heptathlete if I understood some fundamentals of. A really good example is how to throw.
Yeah.
Big thing. Like I went to World Juniors and I was like, I couldn't throw a javelin.
Yeah.
I was really lucky that the school lent me one at the time, so I could go practice in the backyard before I went to World Juniors, and that was probably one of the greatest trips I've ever been on. I came fifth at World Juniors, but I had no idea what I was doing, and I think being naive really contributed to that. But then there's that whole idea of like, yep, you jump in and you do everything, you just give it a go, and it's really fun. But then also, like I said, in hindsight, there's a lot of me now kind of being 2018 towards the end of my career, and I'm just starting to learn things that I realized that I should have learned when I was 16, a lot of the technical things. And I guess even understanding the sport from the technical side, it was something that I seriously probably haven't looked into until the last couple of years.
Yeah.
I mean, even going through my career from when I was a junior up until now, I went from heptathlon and I moved into 400 hurdles. I got into 400 hurdles not knowing how to hurdle on the other leg.
Yeah.
And so I'd say from my perspective as well, there's always that side that actually if I took the time to learn those skills, to understand the fundamentals, I probably would have been able to have smoother progressions.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I'm very much like a lessons learned type athlete, I think.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure every coach I've worked for would say the same thing.
Yeah. I was going to ask then, of all the events you chose to now specialize in a non-heptathlon event, the 400 hurdles, like what made you decide heptathlon, like I've had enough? And I mean, it may have been, what you touched on, not having that like fundamental understanding of like technical elements or the throws and stuff. But what was it that kind of pushed you towards the 400 hurdles?
Yeah, so the biggest thing for me is that I went from World Juniors in 2012 doing heptathlon, continuing to do heptathlon right up till 2015. I went to the World Champs. But all that time between, I never found the coaching setup that I needed to support me in my development across all the different areas.
Yeah.
So that was always kind of a big downside for me. And then after 2015, 2016, I ended up going over to France, finding a coach, finding a setup. But ultimately, I think it comes back down to that. For me, I missed so many basics and fundamentals from being a kid though as well, that as I became a senior, it really started to show quite a lot. And I think when I was in Europe as well, the coaches used to just could not believe I'd gotten as far as I did, just not knowing how to do anything.
Yeah.
And then it was from being in France, one of the coaches just told me to go out and run a 400 meter hurdle. He's like, you can hurdle, you run a reasonably good 8, just see what happens. So I actually tried out my first 400 hurdles in about, I think it was 2017. And then it was one of those things, I think I ran around the 58, maybe. The first one I did might have been like just under a minute, then I ran 58 seconds. And then from there, it was actually a massive encouragement from the coach, just say, hey, this is a pretty good event for you to do. I think at the time as well, there wasn't a massive amount of competition in the like kind of worldwide. There was a little bit of a gap in the event as well, so it made sense for me to be able to travel with the team that I was training with to get into some bigger events and stuff as well. So it was kind of like logistically, it worked out well. The coach really encouraged it. I think the coach was also just like, I need some success. Yeah. This heptathlon thing is so hard. Yeah. So, just change events, quick success.
Yeah. I mean, you've chosen the 4 hurdles. I mean, at the time, there may not have been like that many. It may not have been as big of an event as it is now, but then like the standard of the 400 hurdles is definitely like picked up a lot, especially like the past 2-3 years. So no, it's exciting. It's exciting to see it. But you've been talking about going to France, and you're training alongside now world record holder Kevin Meyer for a bit. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, firstly, like, how did that opportunity come about for you to get to France and to train with one of the best athletes in the world?
I was actually really fortunate that when I went to World Champs in 2015, Jean-Yves, the French coach at the time, who was coaching Kevin as well, he just came up and started chatting to me after the event. After the heptathlon, I did pretty well. I came 16th. I was pretty much no one had heard of me on the international stage. Yeah. There was just like a lot of things that probably made it quite recognizable for a coach to tell that someone was a bit of an amateur. Yeah. So, he kind of saw the opportunity as well, and he invited me over to come visit them in France and do a competition. So I thought, well, I'll go do this competition, see how it goes. So I went to do my first Decathlon, which was, it was probably one of the best events I've ever done. I didn't really realize that side of athletics existed at the time. Yeah. Just those international competitions where you're not competing for your country, but for yourself, for your club, for your sponsorship type stuff. So I did that after the World Champs in 2015, and then they went for the French always go, I'm not sure if they still do, but they always go for a training camp in South Africa in their winter. And they invited me to come over with their whole French team. And the experience was just like incredible. It was super amazing. It was amazing to be in an environment where you have a team of 100 people. So it was a whole French, like their whole national team, turn up. They were all staying at the same place. They eat at the same place, and just training with this group of people at the professional level. And I think it was the first time I was actually exposed to what professional sports really look like.
Because athletics in New Zealand, there aren't 100 people turning up to hot meets on the weekend, so for like 100 people in a national team to be going to like one training camp is, that's on par with like our top team sports, probably even better than that.
Yeah, 100%. I think that was a big thing for me as well, to understand that there was a professional side to sport. So it was more than a hobby. Yeah. And I know it sounds crazy, but it took me till 2015 to actually recognize that. And it wasn't really until I spent this time with this French team and with this coach that I actually realized that those things were available. So after having a really great training camp with them, I decided I'd jump ship and moved to Montpellier and train just with the group. And I joined the club there at the time, and just went from there.
And what was the experience like? I know you just mentioned before we started recording that you've trained in Aussie as well. What's it like for you to, like you say, jump ship to a brand new country and start training? Because I know for me, going to the US, it was hard, but at least I was going into an environment where everyone was kind of the same. You're all there in the same setup, studying, training. But for you, it's more like you've moved over to a training environment where everyone has individual lives. Everyone's doing their own thing. You're not in a school team environment. So what's that like for you to get over to a brand new place and set up a new life solely for training?
Yeah, the experience was, in hindsight, the experience was like, you would probably think I was borderline crazy when I think about it now. The fact that I just packed up my life, moved somewhere where, one, I didn't speak the language. Yeah. I I genuinely spoke zero French
Yeah.
when I turned up to France. I didn't speak any French. So that was a difficult thing. But also moving to a smaller town where no one spoke English.
Yeah.
That was a little bit of it was something that I didn't factor into, right? So it was something I didn't think about at the time, which made, I guess, the first couple of months a little bit harder. But it's crazy how quick you will learn, especially when you've got a coach screaming in French on the sideline at you, just the same thing over and over again.
Yeah. Well, you learn what that phrase means.
Yeah. And I was like, you learn pretty bloody quickly, especially when they start yelling at you and stuff. But again, it was moving into an environment where everyone did multi-events. There were multiple coaches, and you would move around with all the different coaches and the different athletes. You were definitely, it was almost like being in a team sport, I guess, because we spent most of our time together training. Then we'd go to the cafeteria, eat like lunch and stuff together. We all saw the same physios. And then we would travel to competitions on the weekends as well. And you'd get on the team bus and stuff like that. So it was very much a team environment. Everyone turns up to the competitions like kitted out in their club uniform and like dressed up in flags and stuff. Very different to what we get in New Zealand.
Different experience. Okay, but it sounds like it definitely was more of like an organized. So was it training with like the national team, or it was with like the club, but at the club level they're still very like team orientated?
So I guess it's the same as like if you think about in Auckland, you've got like Bays and all these other clubs. Everyone trains at Bays, but not everyone belongs to that that club, but everyone goes there to be with the coach, so the coaches have their teams. So it's team based on your coach rather than the club. It doesn't really compare to anything that we have here. Maybe it compares to something in the States, maybe.
It does sound like a little bit like maybe the collegiate system, where you go to a school to train with the uni coaches, and then post collegiately you move on to like a separate coach and have that sort of like team training environment. So, but nothing like in New Zealand.
It's not like it's definitely not the national squad, and I mean it's definitely not the Montpellier is not the national centre in France. The national facilities up in Paris, and that's where a lot of like the national squads are considered to train. But actually, I feel like the multi-eventers had it right because they all trained down the south where it was sunny all year round, and stuff. So it was kind of more like the multi-eventers had chosen to move south, while the rest of them stayed up in Paris.
Right. No, I mean, just a crazy experience to be. I mean, the way you got approached to get over there to then going and training with some pretty cool people. I think it's cool to see like the opportunities you can get through athletics, which I think a lot of people may not really see. Like I didn't know that there would even be an opportunity for someone from New Zealand. So
I think there was I think the opportunities for me definitely came up attending things like World Juniors and World Champs, because I had the same opportunity to go to the States when I was went to World Juniors, and then I decided not to, and then I had the same had an opportunity when I went to World Champs, obviously, to go to France and stuff. But I think it isn't something that's kind of actively promoted in New Zealand, that there are those different pathways. And I think one of the big things for me was like being able to compete for a club in Europe in France just meant that I had those connections, right? So even if I want to go back now, I have like a place to go. I have a place I can train, a place that I'm familiar with. And I think that's one of the hardest things when you start to travel with sport, especially when you're doing it independently, not with a club. It's like, how do you get into places? Where do you stay? How do you train at facilities? I
think connections within athletics is huge for that reason. Like being able to travel, train places, get into competitions, if you are looking to go to Europe especially, is pretty important. So I'm glad you brought that up. I now want to talk about juggling work and training. There was recently, like Athletics New Zealand just did like a small webinar on youth retention, which is obviously like a pretty big issue within athletics in New Zealand. So I think a lot of it normally comes about around the time of like high school, university, where people are really starting to choose like, do I continue to pursue sport and athletics, or do I pursue a job? And I know you work in law, which is probably pretty hard on its own, but how have you been able to juggle working in that industry while training and competing at the level that you are?
Um, I guess this is the thing that people ask me the most, and is how you can do both. The biggest thing that I always think is that people have the capacity to do more than one thing.
Yeah.
I mean, especially as a multi-eventer, you know exactly what I mean. You have the capacity. Even you think about the way that people train, you don't just do track. You do your track training, you do your plyos, you do your gym.
Yeah.
You might do 100 and 200s or multiple throws and stuff. So I always think that you definitely have the capacity to do more than one thing. I think that's the attitude that I take towards doing both working full-time and training full-time.
Yeah.
There's definitely been sacrifices. It's about kind of weighing up those points and, you know, where you make sacrifices. So a really big one for me is, you know, it's taken me a long time, but I finally started gym.
Yeah.
So I've finally started going to the gym, right?
Yeah.
And doing strength and conditioning. And it's crazy, you know, again, it's a little bit crazy to think, but I went to World Champs in 2019, and I was just doing a bit of, like, I was just training, but I wasn't actively, you know, I had no program or pathways in my strength and conditioning, and things like that. So a lot of that, I guess, you've always got to have those little sacrifices. And for me, that's the thing, is that it comes down to how much time you have, and what you've got going on in your life, work-wise versus training. But the biggest thing is that giving up strength and conditioning wasn't a priority at the time. So for me, a lot of things, especially in the last couple of years, has been about, you know, relearning technique and getting my hurdle technique down, and that was the priority. And then also in my job, my priority was actually being good at my job, understanding what I do, and stuff as well. So what I end up doing is I always have kind of multiple priorities in work, and then maybe in study, and then also in track. And then I'm like, okay, always do your number one priority for each thing. And then your number two priorities, they come and go. I mean, a big one for me is, like I said, is the strength and conditioning. It's always been a secondary thing that I know that I need to do, and I know that there's a lot of benefit there, but I also can't. I already go to work at 7 o'clock in the morning, so you can't give up. I don't have a lot more time to give up. You know, I'm leaving work at 3 or 4 to go to training, and then coming home late anyway. So but one of the big things for me has definitely been the benefit of lockdown. I've just been given so much more time now to be able to do just more stuff, basically.
Well, I mean, less time on the road, less time traveling, commuting and stuff. Is it, in terms of fitting like work and training in on a daily basis, is it something where work has maybe been like a bit more flexible with times and let you work like maybe earlier in the day? Or is it something that with Morty it's like, all right, I can't get to training until 4 o'clock? Like, how do you like juggle that time balance?
So I start work earlier. I try to, especially when we're in the office in the city, I try to be in the city at like 7, just working, and then I try to leave a little bit earlier to be at the track by 3:30, 4 o'clock. And then Morty's there until 5:30, so you just utilize the time that you've got. But in saying that, like, you know, my work's I'm pretty lucky, because we know they're flexible by default, so I'm allowed to work those earlier hours where needed. But it's actually one thing that quite a lot of athletes, when they graduate university, I've had quite a few of them ask me how I do both, right? Because the hardest thing is when you graduate university and then you move into a full-time role as a grad student, you don't get that choice. And that's a big thing. And I always kind of say, well, the big thing for me was just when you're at that level in an organization, you just got to, again, weigh up what are your priorities. Your priorities to progress your career, knowing that you can work in an office forever, but you can't run on the track forever. And, there's plenty of opportunities to have part-time jobs or be a casual. That's how I started off. First, I started off being a casual worker at a bank and then kind of building my way up. But I built my office life experience through casual work, which gave me that flexibility to do both. Because it's definitely the hardest thing. It's really easy for me to now say, I can juggle both, but I've also developed enough in my career to have enough kind of, enough say to say, hey, look, I work independently anyway. I'm going to do this. I don't need someone to supervise me. And I do know, like I said, I've talked to quite a lot of athletes about how to juggle those expectations. And I think it is quite a big problem, right? Because that's where you lose a lot of athletes is as soon as you kind of lose them at the high school level, moving into university, and then they graduate university. But then it's like something I think as well you learn pretty quickly is that being in an office every day is only glamorous for about 2 months, and then you realize
no,
this is it.
Well, I think honestly, like the hardest part is probably just trying to earn some money, and if you are trying to fit it around training, is where can those opportunities come from? And like you said at the start, it may just be part-time or casual work just to bring in the bills to get a little bit and get some experience in the workplace. So once you get later in your career, you may not need to spend as much time at the track or at training. So getting into a full-time job may be a little bit easier. And like you said, you've got a bit more flexibility with time within like the workspace because you're more experienced.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the big things as well is that people think that you can't start your career because of sport. I'm like, no, you shouldn't put your career on the back burner. I mean, we all know you can get injured very quickly, and what do you do? If you stop getting funded, what do you do? Like, what do people do when you lose your sponsorship or all those types of things? And I think it's the harsh reality of sport. But that's why I'm kind of a big fan of like, you can always start your career. And the biggest thing as well is that I think you've never got to be afraid to actually ask organizations as well what their values are. And a lot of people look for like special character because the things that you can bring to an organization as an athlete is someone who's dedicated to something, someone who's motivated, someone who's thinking outside the box is actually a lot of value. And organizations are kind of actively, especially in this day and age, a little bit more willing to give people those flexibilities and understand that if they grow their athletic career as well, it's going to benefit the organization. But those are not things that anyone kind of told me when I started. I think that's kind of something that I've learned over time. Which is why it's nice for you to be able to share that. And hopefully there are athletes in their late teens, early 20s kind of going through the same thing now. And at least they've got some skills that they can, go to companies and be like, hey. So I think it's good to share that. The last question, which it might be quite a long one, but it's about the Olympics. I did a little like looking up, and to be honest, like for you, it was a really probably shit experience. I looked and you were 42nd on the world ranking in terms of the 400 meter hurdles, and you would have been the 35th athlete out of 40 in the quota spot for the Olympics. In terms of by World Athletics standard, you're done enough to warrant being at the Olympics and competing for New Zealand, but you weren't taken. Can you explain the situation a bit? Because I know I am a little confused by it, and I think there are probably a lot of people within athletics and just sport in general who just don't understand what happened there. So it'd be nice to be able to hear a little insight on the Olympic situation. Yeah, sure. So this is also a question I get asked quite a lot. Obviously, some athletes have been much more public
Yeah.
about their opinions on it, and I haven't like said anything. But so for me, so I guess the fundamentals of it to start off with is understanding that there are some events in athletics are solely organised and selection comes from athletics.
Yeah.
So World Athletics sets the standard and athletics selects the people based on what the World Athletics standard is. So World Athletics standard is it's just the entry standard, right?
Yeah.
We have it in every event. You've got to meet an entry standard. And that's just things like world champs, world juniors, those kind of events. Athletics are the sole selector. So I've never had any issues getting into those events. When it comes to things like Olympics and Commonwealth Games, they're slightly different because the way that they're set up is that they're basically they're organised events between international countries across obviously multiple sport. And they're run by the IOC, and in New Zealand, the selectors is the NZOC. So World Athletics has their standards and they say, cool, this is our standard of entry to get into the Olympics. And then Athletics New Zealand say, okay, we've made this policy and this is what our policy is based on what they've said. So, but then the ultimate selectors for Olympics and the Commonwealth Games will always be the New Zealand Olympic Committee. So the process is that the first thing you want to do is try to tick off that you're eligible by the World Athletics standard. So I think for 400 hurdles, it was there was an automatic plus I think it was top 50. Oh no, 35, 42. 40. I don't even know. 40, yeah, 40. Yeah, so it's like that was your two options. So you either got the automatic, otherwise, if you're in the top 40, World Athletics say, yep, you can go to the Olympics. That's fine. Yeah. Athletics New Zealand have a slightly harder standard than that. The reason they have a slightly harder standard comes down to the fundamentals of money, right? So it comes down to how they get their funding, how they get money, so how they develop their own strategy. But even based on that, they had really, they had pretty good faith in what my capabilities were. So they put me forward to be selected. So they basically, Athletics New Zealand then said, yep, well, we know you're going to be in the top 40 in the world. We know that, yes, you got DQ'd at
World Champs
and Doha at World Champs, but it was a technical DQ. I didn't run across, the field or something. So the time is quite relative. So we're still going to select you. And then once I've made that selection, then they pass it on to the NZOC and they say, as the experts in athletics, we recommend that you select person A, B, C, D.
Yeah.
And then there's a panel of people that then decide, they look at all the people that have been recommended, and then they decide, okay, well, we have a criteria and their criteria is top 16. And then they go along and they say, okay, yep, we think this person can make a criteria. This person won't make the criteria. And for me, it got to that point where the NZOC didn't think I would be able to be capable of top 16, but Athletics New Zealand did.
Yeah.
So it becomes very messy because you've got almost like your federation sports or athletics who are the experts advising effectively a panel as well. And and there was a bit of conflict about whether or not I was being able to be selected, and I went back and forth quite a few times. Yeah. And then ultimately NZOC said, well, we have 3 people in this kind of on this borderline, we're only going to take one of them, and I wasn't one of those people. Yeah. And then from there, I kind of went back, looked at the policy, did all the fun paperwork stuff, and then I went back and I decided
the stuff you're good at.
Yeah. So I decided to make an appeal, right? Because I was like, end of the day, if you don't get selected for something, but your own federation has reasons to believe that you're good enough, surely you should question it. So I went ahead and went through the appeal process. And the appeal process in itself is actually quite a difficult one. It's really probably not one that people, it's not really one that you're ever going to go in and win, unless you are hiring full legal teams to provide further evidence that is contrary to what their policy is. But I think the biggest thing to also realize is that even if you do win, so if I went through the process and I appealed and I won, then all the organizations are going to do is create a policy to prevent what I did happening. So if I found a loophole, so the athletes are always obviously in the weaker position in terms of the way that selection and stuff goes. But yeah, it was just I think the biggest thing for me was I can understand, okay, yep, I didn't meet their top 16 criteria.
Yeah.
That's fine. There's no disputes about that. They said the trajectory of the way that I was performing wasn't showing that I was going to reach top 16. And in the conditions of that, it was COVID in 2019, the world champs fell at the end of the year, and I was in Australia, then COVID hit. It kind of happened that I had a whole season, 2 seasons. I had a time frame of Olympic qualifying where I wasn't able to get any competition. And it's just the nature of sports. I chose to come home. I can accept that was the risk I took. But I think the thing that confuses a lot of people and goes to show that where there is probably more issues is when you obviously don't want to compare yourself to other athletes. It's never the way to go. But it gets more confusing when you look at lists and you're saying, okay, if we're applying this evenly, how can someone who's ranked lower in their event or less likely to be less likely to finish 16th or unlikely to finish 16th still be selected, or people who have been named in selections but then actually they never attend, and that happens quite often too. But this is something that I actually kind of went ahead and raised. I asked the question and stuff, and one of the things that's come out for the Commonwealth Games as well is that we actually know now as well is that especially in athletics now, events are ranked. So I don't know if you've seen that. So you've got your priority events, which is your throws and your distance, then your jumps, then your sprints, and then somewhere down the back the hurdles.
And decathlon.
Somewhere around the back there's a
decathlon and hurdles.
Sorry, decathlon didn't even fall in that.
We're not even on the list.
We're not on the list, but it was just like a thing. Is that it's just like I can understand why I didn't get selected. I can understand why people get frustrated why they don't get selected, and I can also. But I was like, what I can't understand is how the policy doesn't get applied equally yet. You're not really, it's also not my right to go ahead and go, hey, Aaron, you've been picked for this. What the hell, man? Like, that's not, because I was like, that's not, you're like, it's good on you, you've done that. So it kind of leaves this really weird gap where no one understands really what they're doing and why some people are selected and aren't selected. And I think it's one of those things that it's probably also, it's a combination of multiple things. A massive lack of education. I know a lot of athletes that I've talked to, it's a massive lack of education and understanding policy, understanding who's in charge of what, and understanding fundamentally why you'll never get selected. I mean, even for me, it's one of those things, you do some planning and people go, in Com Games. I'm just like, I'm the lowest priority event. And I was like, that's fine, because that's the policy says that though, and it's very clear that it's a low priority event. So even under most circumstances, it's unlikely to be an event that I'm going to get selected for. But in fact, I was like, that's a little bit better, because at least it's transparent and I can go, okay, cool, I'll target world champs this year. So it's quite a circular thing.
So I was going to say, just hearing you say that then, because I think that might be one of the bigger confusions is, on one side, you've done enough to meet the standard by world ranking, you've done enough to qualify, but then even if you qualify, you don't get selected. So I think that can be like the disheartening thing for athletes. I mean, selection standards across the board have gone up, especially for like an event like Com Games, which I mean, they're the top events in the world. So of course you have to be the best to get there, and the standards are always going to go up. But yeah, like you just said, you kind of think that now, yeah, you're fighting for 18 spots for the Com Games, and hurdles is a low priority event. You even just kind of admitted that it's an event that you're unlikely to get selected for, possibly. How do you keep training when you that's like the mentality of like, Com Games is something I want to go to, but I mean, what are the chances of me actually making it? I know you did say you'll train for World Champs this year, which is probably more likely to qualify for. But say there was an athlete who may not be at World Champ standard, Olympic standard, but yeah, they're targeting Com Games, but realize that it may not actually be a reality.
So I think the big thing for me is that I prefer it to be way more transparent, right? Because at least I know. It's the worst thing is when you're sitting in a position and you feel as if you're going to make it, or you think, or it's just like, I would rather someone just squash the hope that it's going to happen first, so I can plan better, right? Yeah. Because, but also I understand on the other hand that for some athletes, if this is the only thing that you do and this is your one goal, then it's a hard thing to swallow. But for me, the big thing is that I guess I keep training because I've at this point where I've accepted all of that stuff. I've been through the cycle so many times before, and I've had this conversation. I've been stuck in this position. I've been stuck in this position with Heptathlon, and now I'm in it with 4 hurdles again. And the older I get, the more I've understand the processes, the more I've actually asked questions and stuff like that. And the more I understand it, the easier it is for me to accept. Not to accept that I think that it's correct and that I agree with it. Like, don't get me wrong, I do have a massive problem with a top 16 policy, just purely because I have a feeling, don't quote me on it, because but I have a feeling that the NZOC policy came into play in about the 1990s, and it hasn't really changed a lot since then, which is problematic because you think about how much we've changed. But also I think the whole mentality about trying to get people in top 16 to get medals, it doesn't really reflect the value that an international athlete, international experience has on a community as a whole. So you think about, you think about the value that if you're a teacher who's you're a great athlete, you're good enough to go to the Olympics based on the world standards. And imagine if you went to an Olympics and you come back and imagine cool, you came dead last, but you attended. Imagine how much experience and just how much value you could bring back to your own communities. And I think that's kind of my problem with the whole thing, is that it's like, it's not really thinking about the people and beyond the whole like, oh yeah, cool, we're a small country, we get lots of medals per capita. I'm a massive I don't care how well we do per capita, because thinking about how well we do per capita is extremely limiting. It's more about thinking about, cool, athletics as a sport is dying. Well, how many people, how many role models do we have? How many role models do young athletes have in different events, and stuff as well, especially if we've got athletes that are that good and stuff. So I think that's kind of like effectively my problem with how the policies and stuff sit. But I can still say that, I have those problems with it. I don't like how it is. But while I'm an athlete at the moment, I still have things that I want to achieve in the sport. But that doesn't mean that I don't want to come back to after I've done being the athlete and make that change, because I know how bad it is. Some people are going to say it's good. And I mean, I work in policy, there's always going to be people that love the policy and want to say it is, and there's always going to have people with different interests. But in the interest, I think, of athletes and wider communities and just the value that athletes could have across the board, those standards of being top 16 seem pretty irrelevant. And I mean, the thing that really grinds my gears is 16 is an irrelevant number in a lot of events. because it doesn't represent a semi-final.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just like, what is number in track and field? I mean, in other sport it might be slightly different, but yeah. So I think it's just kind of getting to that point of that, cool, once you understand it, as an athlete, I'm like, okay, I can understand this thing, so I can plan my life, I can plan what I want to do, what events I want to target. But then also there's this point for me that I'm like, cool, there's like a life here for me after being an athlete, still being involved in the sport, but bringing the skills that I have in my day job and stuff like that as well, because because that's quite a big thing. I know we have a lot of like athlete commissions and stuff like that, but I think they always bring really good value, but it's like, cool, how do we bring that value and actually implement change and start? And I was like, that's the hard thing, is that you can keep saying how much you don't like it, but until you understand how to implement change, especially in those kind of organizations, and it's difficult because virtually, just the whole confusion with Olympics and stuff, so many athletes they don't even understand why they don't get selected and stuff like that. So so I mean,
so I guess, from what you've said, like, I guess it's the main thing is to prevent it happening again at future competitions, or to reduce the chance of that confusion happening. It's a thing of transparency and saying, well, it's difficult because even then, like, you still meet the standard, but then you're not selected. But I think as long as there needs to just be I guess, like you said, it's kind of harsh, but squash the hope and say, like, unless you've done this, and it just needs to be one thing rather than like trying to tick off all these boxes. And if you don't tick one of them, there's a chance that you're not picked. But no, I think it's cool that you've said you want to like remain in sport, or make a change in sport even once you're done, like, using your career. I mean, for me personally, that's something that I'm pretty passionate about. And I know there are a lot of people, so it is cool to see that, people like you want to remain involved in sport once you've finished competing. I think it's pretty cool to see.
Yeah, and I mean, it'll be cool it's good because I think the sport needs like people who are athletes, but also people who have skills in those areas and stuff as well. And I think that's always one of the big things that a lot of sport really lacks, is once you start working corporate side as well, you're like, they need people to be able to come in and push for change in the right ways, and actually, so athletes' voices and stuff are, I heard, I guess.
Super interesting. Like, appreciate you again for kind of sharing that side of it, because like you said, you hadn't spoken up about it too much, and I think it can be something a little difficult to talk about. But I mean, it sounds like you're doing well, even though you had that setback, and like, training's going well, and you know what you want to achieve from the sport. So it's good to see.
The only other thing I would say about those, well, I think that regardless of when you wanted to implement change, and say we had the best policy in the world and we changed it and it was great, people are always going to be disappointed. People are always going to miss out. And the hard thing about sport is that when people miss out, it's so incredibly personal that people will always be unhappy. And stuff as well. So that makes it, I guess, that makes the whole issue and stuff much more complicated. And I think that's one thing for me, is that I've kind of had to separate myself from being like, okay, cool, when you go through this process, it is just purely business. It's not, I know I train every day, and I do sport obviously because I love it, but it's very hard to separate yourself from like, okay, I've got to go through these processes to be selected, but this is business. This is not about me personally. And I think that's one big thing that I've learned over the years. That's been a hard thing to learn. But once I kind of got that through, I was like, oh, this is a lot easier to just ride it out, enjoy the sport.
No, that's cool. We'll end it there. I think that was a really cool episode. Lots of good insight on training, traveling, Olympics. It was work. It was cool. If you enjoyed this episode, the best way that you can help to support the podcast is to share this episode around. There are so many topics within this episode that I believe would be super beneficial for so many athletes to hear. So please share it around. Once again, a massive thank you to Portia for being open and sharing just some of the amazing things that you've been able to achieve in a very successful career to date, and especially opening up about your unfortunate Olympic experience. As always, head on over to Instagram and support her athletics career by giving her a follow at Portia Bing. And while you're there, head on over to the Athletes Platform Instagram page and give me a follow as well. Please continue to tell me who you want to hear from next and what you want to hear about, so I can continue to bring you the conversations that you want to hear. I hope you enjoyed episode 6 with Portia Bing, and I hope you all have a great Christmas and a great New Year, and look forward to more episodes coming out 2022.